Welcome, everyone. I'm Kate Kuzminski, the Senior Fellow and Program Director for the CNAS Military Veterans and Society Program. The Center for New American Security is committed to bold, innovative, bipartisan research that drives national security policy forward. The Military Veterans and Society Program focuses our research on military personnel, veterans, and civil military relations. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion of Chris Kolenda's newest book, the second edition of Leadership, The Warrior's Art, with a focus on the book's newest chapter on women as operational leaders. Today's book discussion highlights an important element of military personnel management, the role of leadership in the military. True leadership not only yields outcomes on the battlefield, but is necessary for building the culture for recruitment and the climate necessary to retain the talent the nation needs to fight and win the next war. We are fortunate to be joined by Chris Kolenda, the lead author and editor of Leadership, The Warrior's Art. Chris is the founder of Strategic Leaders Academy, a retired Army colonel who completed his undergraduate degree at the United States Military Academy at West Point and his PhD through King's College London. We are also joined by two authors of the updated chapter on women and operational leadership, Dr. Kyleanne Hunter and Dr. Jeannette Gaudry Haynie, both of whom are Marine Corps veterans, attack helicopter pilots, and PhDs. I'll turn the conversation over to Chris to give us an overview of his work and the updated edition of the book. I'll then moderate a panel discussion with Chris, Kai, and Jeannette. We'll close with an opportunity for audience Q&A, so please do submit your questions through the CNAS events website as we proceed. So Chris, your book has been a gold standard and assigned reading at military academies since 2001. Why did you feel that it was time to update the book now?
Kate, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate CNAS for putting on this event, and thanks everybody for joining. Well, a lot's happened since 2001. I mean, when you think about it, of course, you've got the big wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've got all of the smaller conflicts that we've engaged in: Libya, Syria, Somalia, etc. Then you've got some major policy changes within the military. So the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, opening all the combat specialties to women. And so we felt it was time to update the book so it continues to stay relevant. And it's exactly why or how in terms of the best ways to study leadership. So I'm just going to switch to my overhead camera here and do a little drawing. And it'll illustrate exactly why we updated the book. So there are three lenses through which you study history or you study leadership. And those three lenses are theory and philosophy, the history of great leaders and organizations, as well as the history of failed leaders and organizations. You can learn, of course, a lot from failure too. I'm a prime example of that. And then you've got contemporary experiences. And I'm just going to label the four intersections here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you've really, to have a complete study of leadership, you've got to use these three lenses. If you don't, then you're going to have shortcomings. So if you're in intersection 1, where you've got theory and history, but you've got no contemporary experience, then you've got no context. You are at risk of creating the right ladder and putting it up against the wrong wall. It's something like it would be akin to trying to institute Hammurabi's Code in today's society. I mean, Hammurabi's Code worked perfectly well in Hammurabi's time, but it's certainly not going to work well today. So if you're missing the contemporary part, you're likely to come up with anachronistic solutions. Number 2, if you've got theory and contemporary experience, but you're lacking history, then you're at risk of a fad. So a fad or presentism. where everything is about the present and we neglect to learn from the past. And then you wind up falling into a lot of these, fads. So think of the leadership and management fads that we've had, especially in the 1990s was classic for fads. Super leadership, total quality management by walking around as opposed to management by sitting still. And then there was the 1 minute manager. I mean, you had all of these different fads and they all sort of imploded after gaining a little bit of popularity. If you are in 3, you have history and you have contemporary experience, but you've got no theory, then you're all tactics and no strategy, because you don't have an organizing model to think about leadership. It's like the chess person who plays one move at a time, and you're up against somebody who knows the Queen's Gambit. And I guarantee you the Queen's Gambit will kick your butt every single time. So it's only when you put all 3 together that you've got a complete study of leadership. And Leadership the Warriors are part of the reason why it's so popular and why people have brought it with them to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, is because it's like the only book that integrates those 3. I mean, most only have 1 of the 3 lenses. Some have 2. This one's got 3, and that's what makes it unique.
That's great. And there's certainly been quite a few policy changes and changes in that contemporary bubble that you outlined. What are some of those changes, and how do you see them playing into the new book?
Well, what we did with the new book is I've updated all the examples in the existing chapters. So we had some examples that, because the book originally came out in 2001, you had some examples that were in the 1980s and 90s. So we've updated those to make them post 2001 examples. So they're most illustrative. Second, we've added 3 chapters. And so one of the chapters was written by Jeannette and Kai, called Developing Operational Leaders Who Happen to Be Women. So the opening combat, all the combat MOSs to women is, this is a huge deal culturally for the military, and doing this right is absolutely vital. A second chapter that's brand new is written by Kayla Williams, CNAS alum, and she talks about how harassment, hazing, and assault damage unit cohesion and readiness. And then the third new chapter is co-authored by Colonel Nate Springer and myself, and it's 8 lessons, leadership lessons we learned in combat in Afghanistan. And a lot of it deals directly with this idea of culture and empathy and respect. And then finally, I just made the book more user-friendly. So when I first wrote it, I was coming out of West Point, an academic environment. Now I've been in a consulting environment. And so I've simplified a lot of the language and then added, each chapter has now got like key points, summary points, and then action steps. So people can use this book and implement right away.
That's great. So as Chris highlighted, certainly the opening of all MOS military occupational specialties to women has an impact as we move forward. I'm going to direct my next question to Kai. We're standing at the precipice of the formation of an entirely new service in the Space Force. This is a once-in-a-generation kind of opportunity to witness. And this is the first time the Space Force has a unique distinction of being the first service created where every MOS is open to 100% gender integration. So what do you hope to see as the Space Force develops, and what leadership skills do you think will be required in that new service?
Thank you so much. And I want to echo Chris for just thanking you for hosting this incredibly important discussion. So I think when we think about Space Force really being unique as the first service that from its beginning, it has gender equality, at least on paper. right, in terms of what women are eligible to do. And I think even moving beyond just gender equality here, we can look at the LGBT equality here as well. I know there's still some discussions around trans being, an executive order, but from a legal congressionally mandated perspective, this is the first time where women, gay, lesbian, and bisexual service members are able to serve openly and equally on paper with their straight white male counterparts. So that really is, I think it's important to look at, this is unique that it's 2021, and that's really the first time this has happened from the ground up. So in looking at what this actually means and sort of what I would say I'd hope to see, and what I think I speak for some of the other folks here too, I want to talk around sort of three lines of operation here. And one is the structural policy side. It's one thing to say, oh, look, we open all jobs to women. We were founded post the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so service members can serve openly. It's another thing to deliberately and proactively implement those structural helping policies that actually ensure that women can serve equally as men. And these are things, everything ranging from how childcare is set up to what parental leave looks like, to what on-ramp, off-ramps for different points in career looks like. Really, what are these structural pillars that are often a lot of these silence inhibitors to women serving fully? Similarly, with the LGBT community as well, that, are you ensuring that you're bringing in medical professionals who are sensitive to some of the unique healthcare needs of those communities, so that it's easy for service members to receive the care that they need? So I think that's number one. So the first thing I think I'd really like to see, just from a structural perspective, is that, women, sexual minorities do have the opportunity to fully serve based on these support aspects of it. The next side of it really is how we're developing and choosing leaders to be part of this too. So it's great to say that service members, our guardians, can have equal opportunity regardless of gender, sexual preference. It's another thing to really deliberately select leaders that understand what it means to actually utilize the talents of a diverse force. And that's where I think Space Force has a real opportunity, because they're able to sort of pick these leaders in a way that other services haven't been able to. If we look at the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and we look at some of these leadership changes that need to take place, we have to focus on changing a deeply ingrained culture with leaders who have been in leadership positions for often over 20 years and have been used to doing things one way, and not just used to it, but have been successful doing things one way, and one way that we know often creates invisible barriers to women, to racial minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. So what the Space Force has the opportunity to do right now is set from the get-go how they are selecting leaders that have empathetic leadership, that understand how to mentor people who may look different than them, who may have different beliefs than them, different sexual orientation with them. So really, where that emphasis is placed, this is a really unique opportunity. And Space Force has the opportunity not to just say, yes, we're opening all of our positions to women, but deliberately including as part of leadership selection criteria these social acumen and more empathetic traits that are there. And finally, I think that is absolutely essential to actually show that you are doing this in a real meaningful way, is to codify some of the positive benefits of diversity that women bring to the force, and not just say, oh, look, we're putting women in these positions, but we expect them to act like little men when they are sitting there, but to actually meaningfully codify some of these differences. And I think right now, when we talk about Space Force, one of the big things that we also need to acknowledge is with Space Force is this shift from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq over the past 20 years to a more strategic competition, where we're looking at a lot of the policy and politics of the military's role, not just, on the ground fighting, but how are we using space technology, Space Force, space doctrine to codify elements of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, both in terms of how women are treated in the service, but also how the service elevates the role of women more broadly across the world? How are we codifying some of the different views of security and what are risks and what might be dangers? How are we codifying some of these differences in processes we know that exist between men and women? So I think when we look at what would be really exciting to see from Space Force, again, along these three lines: one, making sure the support is there so that meaningful participation of women is actually meaningful, selecting the right leaders who understand this side of it, and codifying the benefits that women bring to the service.
That's great. And that tees up a great question for Jeannette, thinking about this shift from the experience of the last 20 years to what the combatant commands are currently focusing on, the shift from counterinsurgency to near peer competition. What are some of the elements of leadership that you see in that shift from the fight for counterinsurgency to near peer competition? And then any thoughts you may have as well on the development of Space Force.
Thank you, Kate. And I can tell that Kai and I have worked together and written together a lot, because as she's talking, my brain is thinking and the words are coming out of your mouth only said much better than I have or could have. So thank you for that. I'll start with the Space Force question, because it really is a unique opportunity to get in on the ground floor and build a structure and a system of processes that work from a talent management and diversity perspective. And, while we were talking about that, I was thinking about the movie Hidden Figures, which we just watched again recently in our house a couple weeks ago. And talent obviously is not confined to one demographic group. It's spread throughout people. And however, in America, because we have such a broad diversity of people with a broad diversity of perspectives, those skills, those talents that they have are also touched by completely different experiences that can give leaders, as they grow, different perspectives in conflict situations. And given the amount of information and the complexity of a conflict situation, having people who can see all sorts of different dimensions and then have the empathy and experience to communicate those in meaningful and impactful ways can be very important. And I was thinking about what if we, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan from Hidden Figures, for example, had lived in a world that recognized their skills and developed them as leaders earlier on. Think how much more of an impact those women alone would have made on NASA and on the United States in the space race of the 60s and 70s. And so, just from that in mind, was thinking about the Space Force. To the question about shifting to strategic, great power competition, and how to adjust our mindset as a nation from the wars of the last 2 decades to what we're looking at now. It really comes down to capitalizing on the strategic strengths of this country, which again are our diversity of experience and perspective and background, and to understand that as you look at a complex situation, you want every mind trying to tackle it. You want problem solvers who can think creatively. I hate to use the phrase outside of the box, but if we get a bunch of people who look alike and come from the same background in a room, odds are they will see a problem in fairly similar ways. You want people who walk in and kind of shake that up, and you want to recognize the value that they bring as a leader, and B, develop them as leaders so that they bring others up with them and can bring those perspectives to bear. So I think thinking about great power competition, we really need to capitalize on and develop that strategic strength, our diversity as a nation, so that we can see problems differently as a nation, we can address those problems differently, and hopefully make different decisions moving forward. On the talent management piece in particular, I remember seeing a couple pictures in the news of Russian and Chinese government officials juxtaposed with US government officials, and the same for military personnel. And it struck me that this really is more than I think we recognize on a regular basis, a strategic strength of the United States. And furthermore, we develop them. And this is what our chapter talks about. How do you develop operational leaders who happen to be women, because anyone can be a leader. They need to be developed. They need to have some baseline of skills, which really opens it up to a significant number of people. And the idea that all of those people would look the same and think the same just doesn't hold water today in America. So it comes down to processing information, processing the situations that are out there from a conflict and competition standpoint, and using the great diversity of American people to solve them.
And Chris, I want to turn it back to you to get your thoughts on the development of a new service in the Space Force or the shift to near peer competition.
Yeah, it's an amazing opportunity that the Space Force has. It's kind of like starting a new company. I work with organizations that founders of new companies all the time, and one of the things that Nate Springer and I write about in our chapter is the importance of getting the culture right away. And part of that is getting your leadership mindset in the right place. And there's a lot of definitions of leadership out there, getting people to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, providing purpose, direction, and motivation. And those are useful. They're also flawed in different ways. Our thought is that leadership is really about inspiring people to contribute their best to the team's success. And every element of that is vital. So you're inspiring. So this is a voluntary. People are contributing their best voluntarily through inspiration rather than coercion. They are contributing their best and most authentic selves. They're bringing their best and most authentic selves to work every single day and using that for the purpose of contributing to the team's success in the mission. And Space Force has got a unique opportunity to get the leadership mindset right, and second, to get the culture mindset right. So I'm going to go back to my famous overhead camera. So Space Force, in terms of developing the culture, both within the organization as a whole, the force as a whole, as well as the individual units, they're here. They're at a start point. And one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to get failure, so they're going to create toxic cultures that don't inspire people to contribute their best, or they're going to succeed. One of two. And it's actually really easy to fail. And you don't even need to try hard to fail. All you need is to drift. And this is the drift line. And people drift when you ignore the little things, when you let the comments go without addressing them, when you don't equip people properly so they feel and look different, ridiculous, rather than like they belong. And the hazing and harassment and assault and all of those things, if left unaddressed, create a hypnotic habits. And once you're in the hypnotic habit of condoning and tolerating those sorts of behaviors that exclude people, that don't inspire people to contribute their best, you are on the fast track to failure. The opposite is powerful as well. So when you institute the right habits right away, you get determination. When the leaders are enforcing the right habits, pretty soon those good habits become hypnotic and you get a successful culture. Now, if this is time, the leap from drift to determination early on is a fairly short one. The longer you let this go, the longer a new organization lets it go, the harder it is to make the jump to success. And at some point, it becomes nearly impossible. So you see some of the current military services that are dealing with this jump, and it's very, very difficult. So the Space Force has got a unique opportunity to get it right and get it right away.
That's great. Kai, one of the things that you've spent a lot of time researching and a fundamental aspect of leadership is the process of building trust between senior leaders and more junior officers and enlisted service members. What barriers still exist at the cross-generational level, and how can or should leaders engage with their people to ensure that they're meeting their needs?
Absolutely. Thanks so much again for this question. I want to touch one thing on the strategic competition real quick, and then jump into the this idea of trust that's there. So I think one thing that's important to think about is as well is when we talk about near peer competition, the DoD is more and more using the term strategic competition to engage with it. And when we think about this, and Jeannette mentioned, looking at these graphics of what American leaders look like versus Russian, Chinese. I think one of the things that we've seen in a way that both Russia and China have attempted to attack what we're doing is through what they refer to as masculization campaigns, and continuing to create these very masculine ideas, which create very monolithic organizations that are there. And so when we look at being strategic and attacking our adversaries' strategies, we need to attack the sense that somehow being monolithic is a strength. And the best way to do that is to develop and engage these diverse operational leaders. So I'll now pivot into this idea of trust, which is absolutely essential. And when we're looking at that diagram that Chris just drew there, the fastest way to get on that drift line is for people to not have trust in their leadership. That's the quickest way, regardless if leadership thinks they're doing the right thing. They can have all the right ideas, the best intentions. And actually, as part of the Independent Review Commission on Military Sexual Assault, what we found a lot was that leaders have good intentions, and service members believe that women, or that leaders have good intentions. Like this notion of good intentions isn't something that was really in question, but it's trust in the system and the practice to do the right thing. And so that lack of trust is really what drives things to failures right away. And when we look at what's driving this, you hinted at it, but one of the biggest parts that's driving trust is this generational gap in understanding the role of the cyber world in creating climates and cultures that are positive and foster good leadership connections. You've got a senior military leaders, and not even like necessarily that senior. I'm looking like 05, 06 and above, and like really E89 above are what tend to be referred to as digital immigrants. We didn't grow up with social media. Basically, everyone sort of Gen X and older, the internet, the digital world was not part of our day-to-day social interaction lives. We were really understanding and learning what socialization was. Service members that are coming in right now, especially younger millennials, Gen Z, the digital world is very, very real. And where we see one of the biggest breakdowns in trust is senior leaders not understanding how to address very real relationships that happen online. Everything from dating relationships that start and almost exist completely on the online space, to knowing what to do when things start to go bad online. With regards to harassment, assault, the surveys we're seeing coming out right now are showing that more and more assault that takes place, or harassment or assault that takes place in the physical world, is almost always precursed by something that happens in the digital world. So this is one of these biggest gaps of trust, and not knowing how to address it, how to engage it, creates a chasm and a gulf that very quickly gets things on that drift slide to failure that is there. Another big sort of blind spot and chasm that exists, and this is generational, but it goes back to this initial idea that leaders have always been rewarded for leading one way, and that is very operational, right? You are tactically and technically proficient, and that is how you succeed in leadership. What we have seen is that issues of harassment and assault have basically been dismissed as being women's issues that aren't part of the operational fight, that aren't part of what makes our unit ready to go do the main thing that we need to do. So for like Jeannette and I as Cobra pilots, leaders were selected based on being really good attack pilots themselves, but also ensuring that the aircrafts are up and ready, their pilots have the qualifications they need, all of those things. Not looking at, are my people ready? Do they trust each other? Is there a healthy climate where they can grow and be valued as an individual and engage in a real and meaningful way? That's just as much part of readiness as, do I have enough aircraft to actually go out and fly this mission? So the other big gulf really comes back to what it means to lead, and which has trust fall apart, right? Because when I had the three of one of the services look at me and say, hey, look, I know more about the quality of my vehicles and the quality of my people in the service, that's a big gap. And it's a gap because, leadership has been rewarded for leading operationally, but our service members, who are our greatest asset, want to be valued as individuals. And so that gulf and that chasm also really starts to undermine meaningful trust that can occur between people.
Building on the concept of trust, Jeannette, the past year or 18 months during the pandemic has in some ways changed the ways that leaders engage with their service members and the demands on leadership. Can you talk about some of the changes required of leadership over the last 18 months and perhaps some elements that you may want to see continue when we return back to the world as normal?
Thank you. And I think we read each other's minds on that, because I was just thinking about that, the world that we've all been living in for the past year and a half, and the reality check that it's been for a lot of leaders. First of all, I want to put a plug in for Chris and his work on this book, because one of the things I really loved about this book was how the presentation of leadership, as he puts forth in this book, is not the kind of stereotypical super masculine strength sort of thing that I grew up with in the Marine Corps. And it spoke to me because it's kind of the form of leadership that I aspire to. And for the first 20 years of my career, dating myself here obviously a little bit, because that means I've had more than 20 years of a career, because I started at age 12. Kidding aside, the first 20 years of my career, I really thought that I wasn't a leader, because I did not embody the kind of stereotypical aggressive, in-your-face type of leadership that I saw demonstrated. And I remember the first time I saw something different as one of my favorite commanding officers when I was still back in the fleet, who retired last year, actually, as a 3-star, which was fantastic for him. And he said, we train, and that's how we fight. So we fight like we train. So you want to start good habit patterns now. And he was really I integrated that squadron from a pilot perspective when I showed up there, and his leadership set the tone for my successful integration of that squadron. And that lesson stuck with me. And I didn't really take it to heart for a long time until the past couple of years, when I started to understand what leadership really was and how the leadership I had been taught differed significantly from what I really understood leadership to be in my advancing age. I had the pleasure of meeting about 2.5 years ago, Lucy Baines Johnson, the daughter of the former president. And I ended up sitting next to her at dinner, and she turned to me and she said, when I meet people in a big room like this, I try to meet 3 new people who don't look or, dress or whatever like me, and learn 3 interesting things about each one of them. She goes, I think she's been doing it for decades. And while as leaders, we should know the people we lead, and not have to be meeting them on a regular basis going through after we've been there for a while. The idea of getting to know the people that you lead and the people that you work with in a way that can introduce their experiences to you in a very granular, familiar level is an important one. And I took that lesson away. I'm really bad about putting it to practice, but that is a form of leadership. And what we saw over the last year and a half with COVID was we saw reality take hold, and that a lot of things that were previously understood to not really be part of our lives. We had this image of an ideal worker. Everyone remembers the BBC Dad video, right, from a few years ago. It seems so kind of cute and antiquated now that everyone was freaking out about his toddler coming in. You know, I say this while the dog is hiding under the bed across the way, and we have people working on the roof of our house, and I just have to strategically mute. But the reality of living through COVID and working from home for many of us has shown a lot of people, shown leaders, and leaders have had to recognize that everybody's got lives. We all have demands on our time, whether those demands are children or a broken house or, you know, a car that we suddenly need to fix and can't get anywhere with, or we're sick, or we have parents to take care of, any number of things, that we all have real lives and real obstacles. And the idea that someone can be present from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, Monday through Friday, and maybe on weekends, exactly when you want them, and to perform as advertised without the reality checks of life interfering, it's not accurate. It doesn't reflect our lives. And so the sooner we understand that people have real things in their lives that impact their ability to function and work, and that they can't live authentically without us acknowledging that and helping them work through those issues so that they can be the best in their position that they can be, the sooner we acknowledge that and understand and integrate it to how we lead and how we work, the better. So I think, you know, one big lesson from COVID, if we're willing to take that lesson and learn from it, and that's a big if, is to recognize that people can function and bring valued perspectives and efforts to a job, but we need to treat them as individuals, and we need to recognize the obstacles they face, help them come up with techniques and ideas to overcome those obstacles or to handle them and deal with them. And that by doing that, we can develop the best in people as leaders.
Thank you for that. Kai, you served as a commissioner on DoD's Independent Review Commission on preventing sexual assault and harassment in the military. And specifically, you worked on issues of culture and climate. What skills or what things can leaders bring to the table that will help shift the tide on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the first things that to tie back to this idea of leadership, because again, leadership shapes culture and climate, right? That's, I think it's one of the things that we know, that leaders are what actually shape the climate. And one of the things that we got hammered on actually quite a bit was this notion that somehow if you have people that have empathy, have social acumen, have an understanding of the lives that their people have to live, it means that you have people who don't have technical and tactical skills. So I think one of the things to do first is to really set that notion to bed. It's one of the big things coming out of the commission that we saw, that often the people that are best at this also are the most tactically and technically proficient, right? Those things tend to go hand in hand. We just need to elevate the right leaders and develop it and grow these skills. So I think, but if we look at some of the key culture and climate aspects that relate to leadership, a few big rocks stand out. One is knowing your people. And this seems very simple and basic, but it seems to get forgotten very quickly. This sense of know who works for you, know what's going on in their lives, know how they operate, what gets them excited, what upsets them, what their fears are. The more you know your people, the better climate you can actually set for them. And the quicker that you can realize if something's going wrong. The next is to deliberately elevate these, what we think of as people issues, to operational issues. And I touched on this a little bit on the last one, but to shape a good climate and culture, we need to elevate what are thought of as like, oh, these are people skills, these are soft issues, these are things to do with like the family or home life. We need to, as leaders, pull those up to be just as important as their ability to shoot well on the rifle range, or to drive a truck really well, or to fly well, whatever that is. We need to like pull those things up, and leadership really sets the example there. And then the other big one is to vote with your time. And we say this not just in who you talk to, who you invest in, who you engage with, but how you talk about training and what's important to your unit. And I think when we talk about things like preventing sexual harassment or assault, and also things like preventing suicide or domestic violence, anything that they are, if it is viewed by leadership as a annual mandatory training that you sit in an auditorium and you click through slides to like get key information and here's Sapper's phone number, you have failed. And I'll say one of the things we wish we could have done in the report is say that it is a court-martial offense to do any training in an auditorium with PowerPoint slides, because we know that as a leadership perspective, we don't learn that way. People don't change behavior. People don't engage. So when what you invest in becomes important is, how do you capture things with regards to your core values? How do you bring these interpersonal skills as part of a core element of what it means to be a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine? How do you spend time having these conversations and developing the leaders under you on empathy, on the ability to have a social engagement? So that's, I think, some of our big rocks. That leadership is a people skill that needs to happen, and those people skills need to really get elevated into the operational realm to make a big difference.
I'm going to turn a very similar question over to Jeannette. So a number of current issues, whether it's women's full integration into combat units, whether it's countering sexual assault or sexual harassment, have been framed as women's issues, when in actuality, they're leadership issues. So what is required of leaders today to address broader climate and culture challenges, and what opportunities might exist?
It's a great question. And while Kai was talking, I was thinking about Lean In, the book and the philosophy and things like that. And I appreciate the premise and I enjoyed the book, but it always fell short for me, because can you ask women to lean in if as they lean in, there's a chasm that opens up and they fall into it, right? Or they get punched in the face, or, it's asking women to make up the difference for what is truly an institutional and leadership failure. I mean, you can't close that gap. So as far as what we do moving forward and how we recognize as an institution, as a nation, as a society, that a lot of these issues about integration and harassment and assault, that these are not just women's issues. First, women, who's doing the assaulting and who's doing the harassing and who's limiting the full integration and who's counting numbers of integration or like percentages of integration, rather than looking specifically at the meaningful and functional integration of women. Women don't control all of those things. That is a leadership and an institutional failure and process as well. So the first thing I would say as a leader is know your people. Echoing what Kai said, echoing what Chris said, know your people, know the obstacles and the barriers that they face, get familiar with those, and start figuring out how to help them overcome them, how to make those barriers decrease within your own command, and push for the decrease of those barriers outside of your command, and get out of your own head. Like, I say this as someone who aspires to learn and lead every single day. If I'm so worried about what I'm going to do or say as a leader, and maybe that I will misstep, then I'm not focusing on the people who actually need to be led and the problems that we face and how to bring those people and their spirits and their brains to bear on the intractable problems that we face. And I think it's a great time as U.S. military enters this pivot or this kind of transformation from the wars of the last 20 years to whatever comes next, to really capitalize on the diverse people we have, to figure out how to lead them, and how to develop ourselves into a more effective organization. And the last thing that I will leave here, because I know we're getting short on time, is if you're familiar with JJ Did Tie Buckle, the acronym, for a long time I've argued that it should be Buckle E, 2 E's, add an E for empathy on the back, because that is one of the most important skills we can bring in there. But yeah, thank you.
I'm going to shift to an audience question that we received that's focused for Jeannette and Kai. Do you think that including women in selective service, which is currently on the docket for the NDAA, helps or hurts integration in the force? What are your thoughts on that? I'll turn it over to Kai first.
I think it helps from just a high level strategic messaging perspective. But I think if we look at this as an actual sort of tactical nuts and bolts thing, it's very unlikely there'll be a big difference. And I always use the example of, for 20 years, we were fighting essentially a two-front war for a good portion of that. And I don't think any 18 to 20-year-old men who didn't volunteer were laying awake at night saying like, oh no, I'm going to get drafted to go fight this war. So from an actual operational perspective, I don't think that there's actually a lot that's going to change. But from a strategic messaging perspective, absolutely. We are a better democracy if we have 100% full participation of our citizenry in our security. And the way to make that happen, is to bring women into the Selective Service in a lot of ways.
Jeannette, any thoughts?
Yes, I agree fully with Kai. And we've had this discussion a number of times between the two of us. I think that a very important aspect of having a draft or Selective Service that would include all people is that the more people you have invested in it, making a decision like that, the better it is for our democracy, especially as we consider, when do we need to commit service members and put them in harm's way. When that decision needs to happen, we need to have all our cards out on the table and to recognize the very real implications for the force, for American families, and for our country as a whole. And having women included in that discussion and as part of that decision is very important.
Here's a question I'll throw out to the group. So in past experience, whenever there's been change, so the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the integration of women into combat positions, the conversation has largely been around, can we do this? But we're now shifting into a mindset of, how can we do this? So what types of leadership skills do you think are required as we shift to the new ways of managing personnel moving forward? And Chris, I'll start with you.
Oh, it's a really important question, of course. And I mean, your culture is only as strong as your most vulnerable member feels that they can contribute their best and most authentic selves. And one of the things when you think about it, and a number of essays in the book, number of the chapters in the book address this, it doesn't take much for an organization to break down. It doesn't take much on the culture side for an organization to completely melt down. We just saw it in Afghanistan. We saw a 300,000 person military disintegrate almost overnight. And it was largely over leadership and cultural issues, nothing to do with equipment or anything like that. It was leadership and culture issues. And so I think it's vital for people to take this, to take this to heart. One of the things I love about Jeannette and Kai's chapter is that they show very practical ways to address the how-to. And part of it is looking at a situation, say how does this set the women in the formation up for success, or is it setting them up for failure? They have a great example of, as both helicopter pilots, if you had to go to the bathroom, just a very, very practical matter like that. If you're a male, it's not a big deal. If you're a woman, you may have to go quarter mile, half a mile to find a porta potty or whatever. And I mean, it's those sort of little things. One of my good friends, Laura Colbert's got a book. She was an MP and a military police officer in Iraq. And she's got a book called Sirens, How to Pee Standing Up. And part of it is, as a Humvee driver, how she just had to improvise to do some of these basic things. And so part of the integration is setting everybody up for success, because our culture is only as strong as the most vulnerable people feel that they can contribute.
Jeannette, any thoughts?
I do. I was reading yesterday, there was an article on the front page of the Washington Post about climate change and how it's going to impact the younger generations and the generational inequality with regards to climate change that the next generation, our kids, grandkids, et cetera, will be facing. And I was thinking about how to lead through that. I look at my kids, I'm trying to raise them to understand what's going on in the world. How do we give that generation the skills to lead through that, to figure out solutions, to compromise, to work together, and to make the really painful decisions that will be required? And while climate change on its face may not have to, as much to do with what we're talking about today, it's about really deep, intractable, complex problems. So what leadership skills will be required? Open-mindedness, selflessness, empathy, and honestly, just the courage to bite the bullet and do it. And otherwise, we're kicking the can down the road. And we saw that happen over the last decade in Afghanistan. I'll go out on a limb and say, and I think that if we don't elevate and act as leaders right now who can make these hard decisions and make these hard changes and adapt the skills to really develop a mindset of change, then we're going to leave the next generation in a worse position, and the problems will be just that much more complex.
Kai, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the other side of this, to sort of move from, like, to include with open-mindedness too, is a really deliberate return to integrity. I think if we're looking at Afghanistan and sort of the transition out and some of the lessons learned there, I think the biggest questions I get asked by cadets every single day has nothing to do with the quality of the Afghan army at all. And I think as someone who spent a lot of time working in there, nothing with that, is that as America, we made promises to individuals and a country. What does it say about our integrity as a nation that we're willing to just walk away from what those promises are? So I think when we look at shaping, we're really at a pivotal moment where personal and professional integrity as part of open-mindedness comes, the ability to move away from entrenched, overly politicized discussions. If we look at these big policy changes that have occurred too, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the inclusion of women into all the services. I mean, even the creation of Space Force, they got caught up in so much, partisan political rhetoric that there were very few, very clear-headed people to come and say, okay, how does this make our country better? I think to Jeanette's point, how do we work through the hard issues with it? And what does it say about the core values of really integrity to make us a more secure, country and really return to a place of global leadership? So I think the other part as we're moving here that we need a lot is real personal integrity that's brought into this, that cuts through the fray and the noise and values the strengths that each individual brings.
Great. Well, we're wrapping up on time here. So, Chris, I want to give you kind of the final word before I close this out. What are you hoping that the impact of this new edition will have on the developing leaders of the force, and not necessarily just those who are already in positions of senior leadership?
Yeah, I hope, like the first edition, which has been in print for 20 years, I think 60,000 people are using it for their leader development. And the second edition, which I think is even better, is, I hope, does the same thing for this next generation. And one of the things that the book does, and I want to highlight Kai and Jeanette's comments, is it helps people go on a journey for why we define leadership the way that we do, why culture is so important, why things like empathy are so important. And I'm going to do one more overhead camera. We're in a digital age, and this is digital communications looks like this. So this is like on, and this is off. We often look at a lot of these leadership and cultural issues as on off, as a light switch. Do this, or do this, don't do this. And it creates a lot of resistance and backlash oftentimes because people don't think digitally. Human beings don't learn digitally. They learn analog. This is analog. And where leadership comes in is you're filling in these spaces, and you're helping people to understand, why is it that on is the right thing to do? What's the impact of it? What's the power? What's the superpower of that? And what is a detrimental effect of off? And the more we help leaders do this, they're going to create buy-in, and buy-in is the foundation of accountability. And that's in many ways, what this book does is gives leaders a way to take people along those journeys so that they are creating buy-in within their formations. And that's when you're going to get a very powerful culture and a very powerful team.
It's great. Wise words to send off to our audience. We really appreciate all three of you joining us today, and we appreciate our audience. Also, a special thank you to our communications team who made this event possible. To stay in touch on future events like this one, you can follow us at cnas.org or on Twitter at CNASDC, and we hope that you'll keep the conversation going.